today's show, we're talking about how human resources is embracing technology to open pathways to employment for people with criminal records and other marginalized workers. We're joined by Christine Lovely, Vice President and Chief Human Resources Officer at Cornell University, Jody Anderson, Director of Technological Innovation at Cornell ILR's Criminal Justice and Employment Initiative, and Matt Salah, Director of Research at Cornell ILR's Criminal Justice and Employment Initiative. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Before we start our discussion, I'd like to provide some context regarding the magnitude of the problem our panel will address. There are 2.1 million people incarcerated in the United States and 4.4 million on probation or parole supervision. About 600,000 people re-enter society each year, which is about 10,000 people every week. There are 70 to 100 million Americans with criminal records, and over the years, a punitive criminal legal system has had a disparate impact on communities of color, particularly where it concerns work. For example, there's a 30% unemployment 2 years after release from prison. Formerly incarcerated individuals are 5 times more likely to be unemployed, and having a criminal record reduces employer callback by 50%. Now, for the viewers, you may submit any questions you have in the chat, and we'll try to get to them depending on how our conversation goes today. We thank you for your participation. There'll be a lot of useful links during the show, both for job seekers and employers, so look out for that in the chat. And your feedback is critical to the work we do here. So please take a moment at the end, let us know how we did, and keep an eye out for that QR code. So I want to start with Christine. Christine, you've been a champion for inclusive hiring practices throughout your career, particularly for workers with criminal records, and also breaking down educational barriers. What's been your approach to this work?
Yeah, first I'll just share how I became aware of this issue. It was actually at another institution, and I was invited to be a part of a pilot working with the State Department of Correction and Rehabilitation. And what they shared with me was they had individuals that were really working on their rehabilitation. They were working on their educational pursuits. They were trying to get ready for work, but they had trouble with placements for work. So the conversation went to a place of us thinking about how we could meet up with our two interests. They had interest in placing folks, and we had a need for talent and for employees. And once I learned more about the data with these individuals and how qualified they were and how prepared they were, but just needed an opportunity, it seems like a really good meeting of the minds took place. And so because of that, we started a pilot at that institution where we were placing individuals in positions, and at the time that I left, it was proving to be a successful pursuit. So that really taught me something about removing barriers so that individuals feel like they're qualified and they have an opportunity that they can pursue. And so from there, it's always been for me about removing unnecessary barriers to folks feeling like they're not qualified, or when in fact they could be qualified or even overqualified for positions, but just not feeling like there's an open door. And so that's really been the emphasis for me, is on removing some of those barriers and making sure that opportunities are open for individuals to be able to apply and hopefully successfully obtain roles.
Now, you've talked about this issue, you've been a thought leader in the space, but it doesn't end there. You've actually done the work, you've put in programs, and when you came to Cornell, you started to bring some initiatives here. Can you talk a little bit about some of the programs that you've done here at Cornell to sort of signal that priority that you have?
Yeah, and obviously, an obvious one is the restorative record that we're actually piloting, and we're going to launch in January, so I'm super excited about that. But Cornell had already demonstrated a commitment in this space before with other programs. We had already put into place removing educational barriers, such as requiring degrees for positions that didn't really require a degree. So we removed some of those requirements from postings for positions. We removed some of those educational requirements where a degree really wasn't necessary. And also there's a Pathways program that's really targeted towards individuals with disabilities. So that's been in place. And then even before I came, we had folks on our talent team that were going to places where candidates were and meeting them where they are to share opportunities that exist at Cornell for them as potential placements for them for employment. And I'm really excited to share that in September, we hired a fair chance employment specialist, someone that's going to not only help us to launch the restorative record, but also helping with our candidates once they're placed and being successful in those roles. So really taking the lead in ensuring that any necessary resources are made available, that they're not just hired and then just left to their own devices, but we want individuals that come on board at Cornell to be successful in their roles. Always, all of our employees, we want them to be successful. So we want to ensure that employees have what they need in order to be successful in those roles once hired. So
that's great. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the restorative record. But you come to a university, you're HR leader, you have goals of inclusive hiring, of expanding the talent pool, but really focusing on kind of who's the best worker for the job. From your perch as a leader in the space, what kind of challenges do you face when you're trying to, you have an agenda, you want to move it through a big organization with lots of different viewpoints? Can you share just some of the things that you've experienced or how you kind of keep pushing through those agendas?
Yeah, there's always going to be challenges when you're trying to do something new or different. And so I've been able to get past that by starting new initiatives via a pilot route, sort of something that's being tested and tried. And that way people aren't as concerned or threatened by feeling that something's going to be just ultimately changed permanently. So if you can do a little test run of different initiatives and be able to demonstrate success and demonstrate the value that it adds to an organization, I think that's a helpful way of sort of approaching that. And it's also helpful to talk about, sort of what's in it for them. What are they getting out of this? And I know for us at Cornell, it's, for all positions, we don't have just like a huge talent pool. And so anything that we could do to expand those pools and to include even more people in there that might be successful in a role, all the better. So, and I think everyone shares that desire. So focusing in on, the value that can be added for all of us, I think is one way that we kind of get people to loosen up a little bit and relax and maybe try something new.
Thanks. Jody, we've been working together since your Stanford days where you went to undergrad and you got your master's degree. You've been in Silicon Valley now for a number of years. You're steeped in that culture. Can you tell us, how do you envision software-driven solutions to bring innovation to hiring practices, particularly for marginalized groups who have not been as advantaged by some of the technological advancements?
I appreciate that, the $1 million question for sure. So maybe we'll start with a bit of a philosophical approach. So Mark Andreessen, co-founder of A16Z, he has this theory that software is eating the world, right? And that may sound a bit aggressive, but it's just that the most valuable, let's say, companies or just periods in time have been driven by like software-enabled like companies. So you think the dawn of the internet, how many individuals that is impacting, right? It's literally changed the world, transformed the world. And there are industries, some of them still remain today, that may be resistant to that. So Christine was talking about moving, initiatives through a large, complex organization that exists in every single industry. Many of those industries have indeed been disrupted by technology, particularly software. Now, if we rewind back, 30 years ago, 20-something years ago, before I was born for sure, these new kind of like internet or software-enabled companies were new entrants into the market. And I think it was a bit unprecedented. People didn't know what to expect. But over time, they create immense value for society and change the way humans interact with each other. So everything from, you think of the Netflix of the world, the Airbnbs, Stripe, you can name it, Disney, all of them. And then some traditional industries, manufacturing, all of them are driven by software to some degree. And so you have that perspective. And one of the last remaining, let's say, industries or sectors is the criminal justice industry, right? For lack of a better term, that hasn't been disrupted, right? But that still controls large facets of people's lives, right? And there are some detrimental consequences that you highlighted earlier. And so the theory there is that justice technology can be a similarly like disruptive force in this space, right? And that hasn't happened quite yet, but there's a burgeoning crop of startups and other innovators who are building software-enabled solutions directly into this space. And I think the analogy that software has this potential to reach a global scale, right? Billions of people are online. Everything we do is online. There's a segment of the population that's removed from all those advancements. We typically see that on the commercial side, but let's think about the incarcerated populations. They don't have access to the internet, Wi-Fi, technology, like none of it. So they're missing out on all these innovations, but then they're also hindered or disadvantaged because they're not onboarded to clearly what the future is that we're all presently living in. And so I think the opportunity is there. You mentioned 70 to 100 million people who are impacted by the criminal justice system. Well, you have scale there, right? And I think piecemeal efforts, they'll get us some of the way, but you need those transformational ideas to really, create the impact that you're looking for. So we firmly believe in that, drinking the Kool-Aid of Silicon Valley for sure, but I truly believe in it. And I think more on a personal level, like my entire life was transformed by software, right? And that may sound a bit abstract, but you gave us some stats on the amount of people who are incarcerated, how it disproportionately affects communities of color. Same thing in my case, my entire family, right? So I was incarcerated as a kid, right? Faced all the same barriers that many people face. Upwards of 100 million people face these barriers, so it's not an isolated incident. It shouldn't come as a surprise. And lovely, you were speaking about the work you were doing with the Department of Corrections, and I think they're coming to the light that, okay, we need to have technology in these institutions in order to enable some of the advances that we want to bring to this population. But I can never get a traditional job, right? Because I would still run up against the same barriers, background check, and, they find out things about you, and then you're disqualified, or you're actually filtered out of the entire, candidate kind of cycle because you have a, let's say, scarlet letter on your past. And so only at, software companies, particularly Reddit, where they're like, oh, well, we care about your talent, your skills, please come on board. And then I went through a background check through Checker, which is another software enabled company out of Y Combinator that had a more streamlined approach, right, to conducting these background checks and allow candidates to present more information, compelling information, et cetera. But they've also transformed that industry. So that landed me on my first job. And then seeing that in tech was we needed to bring this workflow more ingrained into all the systems that are negatively impacting people's lives. And so that's my big thesis, but I think we're doing that actively today.
And Jody, when you bring these new ideas, right, with transformational impact, there's obviously organizations that are using outdated tools, outdated methods. How do you deal with that when you're coming in with something new that's going to require some training, that's going to require more advancements? How do you deal with that? What's your strategy?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'll quote another person who's not here today, but Paul Graham out of Y Combinator. It said, if you peek around the corner and you see the future, right, that gives you an advantage. And then it's on you as an innovator to find a way to bring a swath of humanity to that future with you. And that's how you really are going to experience that impact, but also the value that you're going to be able to create. And so I think the responsibility is on you as an innovator, despite the difficulties or challenges that you're going to foresee. But everyone's using these systems already, right? And it used to be super expensive to build anything, but now those costs have been reduced dramatically, right? And so because all these systems are integrated with each other already, largely out of the knowledge of the people who are using them, as a technologist, you have the ability to integrate with every single system that someone uses, right? And to make it easier for them to take the actions that you believe are right, that create more opportunity for people without disrupting their day, right? Of course, you need to spend some political capital, which you and Lovely do very expertly. But on the technology side, once you get that buy-in, the technology is really easy to implement. In the same way you can order anything at your fingertips instantly and it comes, right? We can do that with technology, helping people get access to employment, educational opportunities, and other advantages that the rest of society is, taking advantage of.
And Jody, a lot of your technological development is based on, obviously, research. Some of that coming from our colleague, Matt. Matt, you've been examining barriers to work for underrepresented groups. A lot of your research looks at these issues, and you've taken some time to think about it. One of the things you talk about is sort of non-traditional factors in the workplace. Can you tell us how you look at those things and how that impacts the work that you do?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So first of all, one thing we come at this with is that the existing criminal background check process and third-party background check process is very negative-facing. It's fear-based. It's risk-based. So on the one hand, when a person is reviewing a background check in the context of a hire, they're not looking at the whole person. They're thinking of the person in terms of what are their potential risks to the organization. The reality is, though, these things that people worry about, they don't happen very often at all. So they aren't a good way to predict who's going to be a good employee. The thing that we've been looking at is there are many more positive humanizing factors that a person engages in other than what their criminal background check shows that are known strong predictors of whether they're going to be a good employee. Ultimately, that's what employers care about the most, right? And as we've kind of had alluded to by Jody and Christine, this has become a big enough problem that employers are artificially limiting their talent pools by sometimes at the point of filtering candidates from jump. So what we've been looking at is other kind of restorative factors, things like hobbies a person might have, whether they've received mentoring or even been a mentor themselves, micro-credentials, which is a huge part of what Cornell does and things like that, and things like counseling received, anything that's indicative of the person's ability to succeed in the world and move on from what happened, often something that happened decades ago, right? That no longer has really any bearing on their ability to be a good employee. So the upside of that is that all of these things, if people are brave enough to share them during the hiring process, they are great predictors of whether somebody's going to be a successful employee. Whether a person had a criminal offense in their past is not a good predictor of whether they're going to be a good employee. That's a myth that's been debunked. So a lot of the work that Jody's done in turning these into technological solutions has focused on, okay, what can we add to the story of this person? How can we humanize this person, but also add utility to employers? Make it that they can feel more confident that they're hiring the right person rather than just focusing on some of the kind of more rote traditional things that you tend to look at, like degrees and things of that nature.
So Matt, I'm an employer, let's say. I've got my cover letter, my resume, we do a background check. I hear a new idea like this. You say, you want me to add more factors to this process, overcomplicating an already overburden? What do you say to employers who really, are not, they're resistant to these kinds of change or this kind of information?
I would say that ultimately the human resource personnel that's having to make these decisions, there's still a lot of burden being put on them when they get these background checks, when they find that information on there. There are inefficiencies within that. Often one person or a small group of people are making really important decisions that affect not only an individual's future, but their future within the organization and the organization's ability to get the best talent. So I would say that, yes, it's adding new factors in, but it's also applying a new paradigm to the hiring process that accounts for just how big this issue has become in the United States, right? As we're harping on the fact that this is no longer a small issue. This is something that employers have to reckon with in order to make the right hires, to get the right talent into their organization. So yes, it might take some work, but I think there are efficiencies in not taking a fear-based, risk-based mindset that ultimately is literally just cutting a big segment of the possible good employees you could have out of consideration.
And it sort of goes back to what Christine was saying earlier, that we're looking for new talent. We want to explore new ways, but if we're just going to rely on the same old methods, how do we achieve that? And that brings me to my next question, Christine. You've been a thought leader in this space. You've been an innovator. How do you think a program like Restorative Records or one of the other initiatives you mentioned can not just impact Cornell, but the field and beyond the walls of Cornell?
Yeah, I have a really good example of an opportunity that I had to share a little bit about our journey here. Earlier this year, I was presenting at a conference, and I was talking about untapped talent pools, and an important part of my presentation was, what led me to saying that we at Cornell are going to pilot this restorative record and some of the thinking behind it. And to say that the individuals at this conference were excited about this possibility is an understatement. People were really interested because we all have the same challenge of not only ensuring that we have broader talent pools, but also more inclusive workplaces. Like, we all have that in common, that we want to achieve and accomplish that. And so hearing about the possibility, and this at the time was just a concept. I had nothing to show at that point. It's just, this is an idea. People were really excited about it. So I envision, once we're actually in play and we're using these methods and we're using this software, is going out there and sharing it with the world and saying, this is what we've been able to accomplish here. And this is the success that we've been able to find. And you too will be able to do the same thing. So I want to take this message far and wide. I want to take it and be able to demonstrate now how we're actually using it and implementing it on our campus. And making it clear that this is a strategy. This is a talent strategy that you can utilize in your various workplaces. So you can tell I'm really excited about this, and just look forward to helping to get the word out there about what's possible. So definitely want to take that to the next step, and maybe like you have me here this time, I can take you with me there, and we can start to spread this strategy in other places.
Yeah, it's really a campaign. It really takes participation. We have an innovator here with technology, of a researcher, an HR leader. I think that's what I'm hearing, that's part of the reason. Now, I want to see this thing. Mm-hmm. So, Jody, you've been working with the Criminal Justice Employment Initiative. Obviously, training and research is a huge part, but really creating digital tools to solve these problems we're talking about. What have you been working on? Can you show us what's been the latest project at the Criminal Justice Employment Initiative?
No, I appreciate that. I think the operative word there is show, for sure. So I'm going to dive into an actual live demo of the Restore the Record platform from the vantage point of a job seeker, right? Let's say in this case, they're going to Cornell University looking for a job. So what you're going to see here on the screen shortly is an individual logging in. You'll see job seekers at the top. And then very prominently, letting the applicant know that we are supporting justice-impacted applicants, right? Because of your skills and values, et cetera. And so here's the main landing page for the restorative record on the Cornell website. They have some FAQs. You can check those out. McNutt will drop the links. But I'm going to go directly to the actual website. So say an individual joins from here. Let's have them log in. This is live, so if something crashes, they will never forgive me. You all can see my password for all the hackers out there. Justice Tech 2025. Okay. Boom. We're in. And so you're going to see very bare bones profile. And so let's go into actually creating the record. So there's an introduction section where individuals explain their personal narrative, languages that they're proficient in, and then you'll see the personal achievements section. So things that they're proud of, that they want to highlight, that's indicative of their progress as a human and a worker. So the ability to upload documentation to support any category that they're making entries into. Again, skills first. I think that is the way of the future. I think that's what we're really interested in. And so outside of someone's criminal justice involvement, what skills do they bring to the table? We want to allow the applicant to highlight those and showcase that. Same thing, all the categories Matt mentioned: community engagement, rehabilitative programming, micro-credentials and certifications, right? So not just the 4-year degree or the 2-year degree, or for those of us who go the PhD route, there are a few of them at this table here. But for those who want more immediate kind of skills that make them more employable, this is a route that many of us are taking currently. And then the more traditional factors like education, hobbies, and anything that they're interested in. And so we're going to fast forward to an actual fully complete profile. Log in.
And Matt, does this tool that Jody's showing us now, embody some of the research that you've been talking about, incorporating the other factors into this hiring decision?
Yeah, I mean, so Jody very much built this based on the background research that we did, obviously with a lot of help. And I think the big thing here, as it gets back to your question about efficiency, is it's looking at a criminal background check. It's still this inscrutable, hard to understand document, right? So what we're doing is adding necessary context through a tool like this. So we're kind of making the argument it does save time. It does help with that individualized assessment.
No, solid. And so even during this assessment, say you're, creating your profile and you want to highlight, okay, I've got this micro-credential certification, and you can upload evidence that'll demonstrate that. So the HR specialist or manager or reviewer can see that and say, oh, okay, well, this is all legit. This is all valid. Again, mentors and recommendations. They can check those references, people who are advocating for you, and of course, educational entries. What you've done on the employment side, whether you are incarcerated or post-incarceration, is important too. So we want to give the candidate the ability to demonstrate that as well. And what you'll see here is, again, the ability to share their profile with someone in HR who is requesting this, or with someone in their network that can help review it and make sure that it's refined and make sure they're presenting themselves in the most holistic fashion. But while we're there, I think that's definitely from like the user perspective. We want to make these tools accessible, right, and user-friendly for individuals who need that extra kind of boost, right, and need to know that at whatever stage they are in the candidate journey, we have solutions for them. I think the operative word there is like a vertically integrated like HR platform. And that means that we have to integrate with HR platforms, so human resource information systems. And so what you're going to see here shortly is that from the Workday side, right? So Cornell uses Workday, right? And in order to build a scalable solution, you have to integrate with the leading HR platforms, which happens to be Workday in this case, but we can do it with anything, right? So right from the HR manager's perspective, they can order a restorative record directly from the platform, never have to leave Workday. So again, whatever they're used to using, we can integrate with that, and they can do all the reviews from inside the platform, actually get a chance to see where is a candidate in this journey, where do they need some additional assistance, and make sure you're not losing valuable candidates in the pipeline. That comes with a link to the restorative record that the candidate has made, that has been reviewed by their network, that has all their support and documentation, a really compelling profile, all within the Workday system. And that is our like strategy, just writ large. We think the ability to reach scale through this kind of approach is imminent, right? There are tens of millions of people who are impacted, who are not given a chance to really demonstrate their employability, and we're giving them that extra chance to do that. So the theory there is to increase the yield and retention of individuals who are well qualified in a number of cases, as Lovely alluded to, maybe overqualified, right? And just need that chance to get in there. So very much live and ready to deploy.
That's really exciting, Jody. Since we have an employer in the room, I can't help but ask. I know, and Matt has a study that I want to talk about in a minute, but Christine, we know 90% of employers run background checks. Concerns that arise include the stigma. Do these candidates have the right training? We're concerned about negligent hiring lawsuits. How, and certain bias come into play. How can this restorative record help employers navigate some of those concerns, whether valid or not?
Yeah, I feel like what the restorative record does is it makes it easier to make the individualized assessment that we should be doing anyway, right? Like that should have been the case all along. But what this platform does is it allows it to, it gives you a framework and to simplify that individualized assessment that you should be doing anyway, and helps us with, in many places, there are fair chance laws in place that you shouldn't be rejecting folks out of hand as it stands. And this sort of just gives you a framework to make sure that you're complying with all of that. And at the same time, it makes it for a much more efficient process. At least that's what I'm hoping to see. So I'm really, sort of excited to actually get going with using the platform for this purpose. Because I will share that at Cornell, even prior to the restorative record, there was already individualized consideration being given of candidates, and we have justice-impacted individuals that have always been working at Cornell already. But what this does is it allows us to open this up to folks that maybe were a little uncomfortable or were given some notion of automatically just rejecting groups of people. No longer will that be sort of an impediment, because we've now got this wonderful tool that we can utilize to help us with assessing folks and giving a more complete picture of what a candidate brings to the table.
I think you hinted at it, that a lot of employers and organizations want to do the right thing. Mm-hmm. They want to comply with the law. They want new talent. But the legal landscape can be tricky. There's the Fair Credit Reporting Act. In New York, there's Article 23A. Matt, I'm curious, you did a study of employers and HR groups. How are companies doing with these hiring practices? Did you learn anything about whether they're complying and just what the landscape is for hiring people with criminal records?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so we did a recent employer-focused research study that was trying to gather exactly this, right? So we know that a lot of mid-sized, large-sized employers are making fair chance commitments, but what we wanted to look at is how is that translating to HR workflows? How is the traditional hiring process maybe an impediment still to doing the thing you say you want to do, right? So you're a positive actor, you want to be engaging in fair chance hiring. And what we found was some stuff we expected, but other things that were kind of surprising, right? You do see where that breakdown occurs in the HR workflow, right? So we know that, especially in the age of the internet, about 90% of employers are using background checks. In New York State, again, as Christine was saying, it's required to do an individualized assessment. You are not allowed to reject a candidate just because they have a criminal background. But what we also found is that, so this was in New York, but also nationwide, there's confusion even about what that individualized assessment looks like, right? So one thing that was really stark in the survey results that we got, which were across industries and sectors, right? We tried to cover really any employment sector you could think of in this research. But we found that things like how old the person was when they committed the offense, how long it's been since they committed the offense, were not being considered by the majority of respondents. And these were people who had DE&I programs in their place of work. They were trying, right? But that's in an empirical research sense, that's the best predictor possible, right? There's no better predictor than how long it's been since the offense happened, right? So again, kind of in a way, very surprising that that's not even part of most respondents' process of doing an individualized assessment. Another thing we saw was of the 336 human resources, talent acquisition, and DE&I respondents we surveyed, only 13% considered any positive restorative factors, right? So things like anything the person has done since, whether it's or during, with community service, hobbies, interests, counseling, micro-credentials they've attained. And the other problem with that is sometimes applicants feel like those things are stigmatizing. They feel like if they share that, then it's communicating more about their experience and the journey they've been on than they might want to. So the employers might not even have formalized systems in place to collect that kind of information, even though it's a great predictor of success. So again, I just want to repeat that number, 13%. That's startlingly low, which that kind of signifies what we were talking about, that fear-based, risk-based mindset where it's going to be very difficult for you to think of the person as a whole person if you don't consider things like that, right? So kind of runs the gamut of things, and that's very much a part of what we're doing. And again, in New York State, where we are obviously embedded and we care about it, is a particularly interesting case because it has the second most Fortune 500 companies in the country. I think Texas recently passed it, right? So we have these big employers who want to increase their yield of good candidates. They want to move away from traditional hiring practices that are artificially limiting who can work at their company. And I think it creates amazing opportunities.
Matt, we're talking a lot about the experience of a justice impacted job candidate and hiring strategies there. When we look at Jody's tool and hear about what Christina's mentioned in terms of expanding the talent pool, it seems to me that there are other groups that have been excluded from the workplace that might benefit from something like this kind of reimagining of the hiring process. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, and I think so. Like even if you take away like overt discrimination, there are still barriers within traditional hiring processes like employment gaps or lack of certain credentials that are, as Christine was saying, right, when you arbitrarily have like a bachelor's requirement or something like that. And there's other groups. Some of the ones we've been looking at are veterans, people with significant disabilities that might have work gaps for reasons unrelated to their ability to carry out a job. So we are looking at how can some of these non-traditional factors be applied to other groups that typically experience labor market alienation. And again, this isn't something that only private employers care about. Like the state of New York cares about this. The federal government cares about this. They don't want people to be arbitrarily alienated from the labor market. It's not good for society. It's not good for employers who want to get the best employees. So I think the last thing I want to add there is that one really exciting thing I think about work in New York State is that there's both the private side employment, but there's also that public sector employment where there's the government as a type of model employer, filling roles that are crucial for this. You can include human healthcare services or human services and healthcare, disability services, respite care, education, areas where we are currently experiencing labor market shortages, and the state can kind of put itself out there as a model employer. So I think remembering that this isn't, private sector employers are part of the story, but that public sector workforce development side is also really important.
Great. Looks like we got a question from our live audience. I want to go to Mark. Mark says, recruiting and interviewing screening strategies need to solicit those success factors from candidates rather than wait for them to present them. How can employers identify such factors? Anybody want to take that question from Mark?
I think I'll jump in. I think that's a great question, and that couldn't more perfectly map to what the restorative record is, right? So what that is a formal set of criteria that we're encouraging applicants to bring in and also employers to consider that are based in evidence. So it's doing exactly what Mark is saying. It's that the tool is built to bring in structured, empirically validated constructs that they can consider from a candidate that often are invisible in a typical resume and cover letter.
What I was hearing from Christine, oftentimes these processes are not operationalized. There's not a clear tool that can be used that's embedded in the process. Is that right, Christine?
Yeah, that's fair to say. And there's often not a connection between the skills that we're asking about and the actual success in a role. So I think being careful that the questions that you're asking really relate to the necessary skills for a role that's vitally important too.
Jody, when you're creating these tools, when you're thinking about this issue, I know the experience of someone who's justice impacted is first and foremost in your mind. What do they need to be successful? What do they need to navigate this hiring process? Can you tell us what are some of those obstacles? What do they look like? How do they appear? You know, you've said in the past occupational licensing. What sort of challenges from the worker side perspective are they facing?
No, for sure. I really love that you mentioned that because it seems like an isolated problem, right? So you think, all right, the worker is navigating these challenges, but it also impacts the business because businesses thrive and survive off of the talent that they bring in. So I'd mentioned, making sure that you're vertically integrated at every stage of the candidate journey. So you think even when you're first applying, right? And Mark was asking a question about how do you get a candidate to, give this information, right? And so you're at a typical job board. Say it's a ZipRecruiter of the world or an Indeed or a LinkedIn, and you're applying to these jobs. If you know that, or you think that they're not going to be inviting to you, you may abandon the candidate journey, right? And you may seek out other forms of employment. Think gig work, maybe you go to a staffing agency. There are second chance like staffing agencies. So there are some people doing good work there, like Viapath and 2C for an example. But say you're going the traditional route, job boards. You can prompt a candidate, right, that there are resources available to you to explain your journey. And then you're giving the candidate the opportunity to come forward with that information, right? But that trust has to be built in to the actual platform that they're using to apply for the job in the first place. Now you see on Cornell, right? It's very explicit, right? We're doing this. We're inviting you to do this. Candidates are going to respond to that favorably. But there are other areas that they're applying to jobs. And so you can integrate solutions there too as well, with like job boards. You have another scenario in the kind of like screening, right, process that happens. But if the candidate knows that they're not just going to be screened out because of a record or some gaps in employment, or they don't have the right educational criteria, they'll be more forthcoming with what they do have and who they are as an individual. How do they do that? You need to create a platform for them to do that, right? Where they can understand what they're doing, the yield on that, and then the employer can also understand that, and it's streamlined or operationalized across the org. You get to the part about background checks, right? And so there are over like 4,000 of these entities, right? Some of them are very old and archaic, collect information. Some of it's outdated and inaccurate, right? But there are improved ways of doing that. You can integrate at that point too, right? So instead of having the candidate filtered out, you can integrate with background checking companies, right? And have the solution right there. Candidate gets a request to conduct a background check. They may be a little fearful about this, like, oh, that's the end of it, right? But that isn't true, right? There are fair chance hiring policies that Lovely brought up. You could leverage like legislation, right, to have employers go through this process for individualized assessment, but also enable the candidate with the opportunity to come forth with this documentation of their journey, right? So integrating with the checkers of the world, right? There's other players too, but using software as a way to not only nudge, but encourage the candidate to continue all the way down the pipeline until they're face-to-face with the final decision maker who's going to conduct that individualized assessment, that knows how to do that, and then can hit that hire button, right? And invite them into the workforce, finally. And so that's what we're here for. Totally possible.
And I just wanted to add, so Jody just made me think of the fact that there's, in addition to the utility of the tool itself, there is also the power of just going to, I mean, when you go to Cornell's HR landing page, seeing that messaging that you are not automatically disqualified. Some employers don't even know how many people there are filtering out at the point of that landing page. And a lot of human resources research shows that those landing pages are super important, right? How they message to candidates affects who applies. So even just the existence of an alternative tool where you're just not being interrogated for your past is alone can yield, important outcomes.
And Christine, when we talk about now that this is kind of rolling out and being made public, what's important to you as far as the message? What kind of message are we wanting to send to the job applicants and maybe even internally for HR, recruiting staff, folks who do the evaluations? What kind of messaging do we want out there in terms of what this is and why it is important?
Yeah, I think, we've been very outspoken about this, and here's where I give a shout out to Donna Lynch Cunningham, who introduced us. And the opportunity that we had to meet one another was because she was putting on a symposium that really looked at the folks that are often overlooked in this process, not just justice impacted, but other individuals as well. We've talked about some of them here today. And so I think the message that we want to have out there is that we at Cornell are walking the talk. We're not just saying that we are a place for anyone to have any study, but we're actually demonstrating that we are an inclusive workforce, and we do want to be an employer that has practices in action that demonstrate our commitment. And I think we're doing that through this restorative record, and I'm really excited to have this be put in place. And not only just this tool, but also our practices that follow, because the last thing we want is to invite individuals to become part of our workforce and then have them flounder or get lost in the shuffle. So we want to make sure that all of our employees have what they need for success. So we want that message to be broad, and we want that to be part of what we all do as we move forward.
And it seems like, Jody, the restorative record really helps with the access point of getting into the position. But as Christine mentions, it seems like retention and advancement is really key. What are your thoughts about, if this is successful, somebody is on board, what's important to think about when we think about retention, advancement through an organization?
No, for sure. That's probably that may actually be more important than the former. To be quite honest, just making sure that there's career growth opportunities for the individual. Once they get inside the workforce. Clearly, we focus very, very intensely on software, but at the end of the day, it is a people-to-people, not problem, but relationship. And so continuing to have opportunities for upskilling, reskilling, connecting individuals to community-based organizations that can, help out with some of the wraparound services. Of course, technology can help enable that, but it has to be built into the culture. We can nudge people in a particular direction, right? So if we're already in your human resource information system, like we can help divert resources, we can help do some of that career mapping, right? And that can all be automated, but ultimately it's up to the employer, right, to really embrace that, to embrace technology first, but then to embrace this framework that goes beyond your particular tech stack, to really enable individuals to have a thriving career and, demonstrate the value that they have inherent within them.
And Matt, you've looked at a lot of this for workers with disabilities and other underrepresented groups. Can you highlight some of the challenges that you're seeing in your research that's demonstrated kind of really what the problem Restorative Records tries to solve? Is there any other kind of barriers or challenges, whether it's retention or access to work, that you've seen that is part of the effort to solve?
Yeah, so I think like one of the big things here, and I do think this is something that Restorative Record addresses, and there are other things we could talk about, but I think one thing that cuts across, like for instance, applicants with disabilities and applicants with criminal records, is that issue of disclosure. When's the right time to disclose? What do you disclose? How do you make sure that you're entering a supportive environment that's conducive to your career growth and things like that? So because we live in a society that we're kind of correcting, we're making social corrections to some of these discriminatory issues as time goes on. It puts a lot on the individual as well, and often it can be a lot of cognitive load to have to decide when you're going to bring something up and how you're going to bring it up, and it's different for every person, right? And so I think one thing Restorative Record does is it also provides a place for your way of presenting yourself to live. And even if you don't get the job you apply for, you have this that you can, hopefully other employers will adopt this down the line, right? You've started to think about yourself in a different way, which I think can also be powerful.
When is the right time for an employer to see these factors, these non-traditional factors in the hiring process? Is it right out front? Because we know, based on the laws, that background checks, I think in New York City happen after a conditional offer is made. So an employer doesn't actually know about the criminal record until after an offer. In some counties or, outside of New York, that information may happen very early in the process. Any thoughts for any of the panelists about when does an employer need this information for decision making?
Yeah, and I sitting here, I'm not really clear on the process that's been set up for us to launch in January, but I feel that regardless of where the information is disclosed, what's most important is the mindset that goes into looking at a candidate. And what we want to ensure is that at whatever point this assessment takes place, that any individual that's looking at it is looking at a complete picture of a candidate and not just a background check at the point of decision or, an offer is made or whatever the case may be. In order for folks to be successful, we want those that are assessing this to have an open mind and to look at the complete picture. And so that's what I think is so important and where we should put our emphasis, and not so much on, the letter of the law and what it says, but just how we're treating candidates just in general.
I have a thought. I love that tee up, lovely, because I actually agree with that. The beautiful thing about software, I didn't go to law school. Mick not cover that for all of us at the table here. But no matter what the particular law is, right, that's governing your hiring jurisdiction, wherever in the candidate flow or pipeline where you're legally mandated to look at the background check, perform an individualized assessment. We can configure that to happen automatically. So whether you're using Workday or Greenhouse or Lever or iSIMS, you name it, right? Or whatever background check provider you're using as well, we can automate that entire flow based on the policy or legislation that's particular or germane to the districts or the regions that you're hiring. And so I think that's the beauty of it. Like once you come to terms with, we need to be doing this, we ought to be doing this, right? Then it's on us as technologists to say, okay, it happens here, it's automated. You no longer have to think about the technology part, right? It is just happening and enabling you to make the decisions that you want to make or change the culture in the way that you want to do it. I think you highlighted 13% of employers are like, making good on these commitments. They want to do it, but just aren't able to do it because of the confusion. We could eliminate some of that confusion if we know what the law is, and fortunately we do. And it's layering solutions on top of that, right? Done largely in the background without people's awareness, but done in a way that's compliant and that is equitable.
And adaptable.
And adaptable, exactly, as seamless as any experience you have on any kind of commercial application.
And from what we're hearing too, and I think Christine, you touched on this, some of this has been happening, but it happens through informal channels, or maybe it's a reference letter from somebody who's vouching for the credibility of a candidate, or maybe it's a certification that comes in as an attachment to the resume and cover letter. What's the advantage of having this be streamlined, operationalized all in one place? How does that change its ability to impact what really is the bottom line, which is hiring people with criminal records and improving the workforce?
Makes it much more efficient. I'll just put it out there. I mean, rather than having to go and look for things or ask questions, you have it right there in front of you. So, that efficiency and time saver that's related to that, we can't overestimate that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think this is another point that Christine made, right? Which is we were coming at restorative record in a problem-solving way, right? There's that moment in time which is different in different states and different localities where you have to make a decision, right? And you don't want to discriminate, and we know discrimination is happening, but and you're not allowed to ask about a criminal record before that point, depending on where you are. But that doesn't mean that this isn't going to seep into organizational culture, that you do consider non-traditional factors and things like that. If it's on the landing page, if it's something that is part of that, let's call that a back-end process, right? That's still part of your organizational culture. That's still change from within that I think is going to affect the entire application process, how you look at candidates. And ideally, people are hired, then the employers start to see that value. They start to say to themselves, okay, well, we take the criminal record out of it. We considered these other kind of skills-based factors that we didn't consider before. They might change the way that they actually, build their hiring platforms and things like that, or their application platforms and things like that. So I think you have to know what problem you're solving, but then there's also going to be, kind of indirect good that comes from that.
So we have an HR leader, an academic, a tech entrepreneur. Just two questions, and whoever wants to answer, what's next?
I've already said it. We're going to actually use it. That's what's next. And then telling our success story broad and wide, that this is a strategy that can work for various industries. So that's what's next for us.
Yeah, and I'll add real quick that it's exciting that it's super exciting that Cornell is doing this. And then we also have we received some buy-in from the SUNY system, the State University of New York system, right? That they give us a grant to focus on scaling it out to other SUNY schools, right? And then from there, the idea is to keep moving to private sector, whatever workforce development context. I think that the sky's the limit kind of where this could have utility.
No, I'm going to have to dovetail both of those comments. Is definitely once we solve what's happening in higher ed, particularly with Cornell as a kind of like market leader in this space, it's definitely on to the private markets, and then integrating with every human resource information system, every applicant tracking system, every background check provider, right? Every job board that is out there, right? And just making sure that we're able to bring the solution to scale, so we can see some of the benefits that are going to happen internally. But software is eating the world.
And to the other researchers out there, I mean, there's the amount of data that's going to come out of this as well. Like there's other research opportunities. Employers respond to knowing that this is going to improve their bottom line, right? Like we want this to be something. So this is just the first step in that regard too. Like this is an unprecedented opportunity to look at change with a research lens from within a large employer, right? And from there, then you have to start making that use case and explaining that utility in ways that employers respond to, right? Because that's ultimately your job with something like this.
It's good timing. I think we have a question from our audience. This question comes from Beth. Are you working within industries that have very restrictive hiring requirements due to regulatory requirements? The example she gives is FINRA, registered firms in the financial industry.
I would say that there's just some legislation that was dropped for this specific group, right? Like some federal legislation that they're not allowed to discriminate against individuals with a criminal record. And I think Dr. Sai's been making some policy recommendations to like New York State in general about the restrictions that are surrounding these like blanket kind of restrictions for people that have records to gain access to employment. And so that regulation is what we want to build on top of. In the same way that Lovely was mentioning the fair chance hiring policies and laws that exist in certain jurisdictions, we layer solutions on top of that. Same thing at the Fed level. When you think about banks and fintech, et cetera, you do the same thing there. Legislation is already set. We know what employers are supposed to be doing, right? And then we build software to enable those solutions to actually be brought to the industry at scale.
And I think Beth's question hints at that there's a lot of industries that there are necessary restrictions. Background checking is important. Matt, you've done a lot of look at these issues around occupational restrictions. What can you say about this piece?
I think, it's undeniable that policy is a huge part of this. And a lot of, New York State has 500 laws just restricting what types of jobs a person can have if they have a felony conviction. Nothing about the work we do makes it that those laws don't apply, but there's also, these laws are often confusing. Like in New York, I'll keep using New York State as an example. That doesn't mean you can just say, okay, we're in the healthcare sector, we're in finance, we're in education, right? Higher education is one of those regulated spaces. That doesn't mean you can just say, okay, any felony conviction ever, you're just automatically disqualified. That's actually violating the law. So it is a policy thing. We do have to work with our state legislatures, with the federal government to try to kind of repeal some of those laws, which they're a remnant of a punitive time in the United States, and we can't pretend they don't exist. But there's, as Jody was saying, there's new laws popping up that protect people's civil rights, right? So that makes it really hard to navigate if you're an employer. So one of the goals here is to not, we're not undermining existing policy, but we're helping employers navigate these kind of differential rules that are being shown. And there are reasonable restrictions in any job, right? But like that, many of these laws are not written to be nuanced. They're just say if you had any felony conviction ever in your entire life, you can't be an insurance adjuster. That's not a great policy, right? So I think that's part of why we kind of take that whole gamut in our focus is like you do have to work with your policymakers to change these things, right? This mass incarceration wasn't an accident, right? It was a result of a lot of public policy. So
where's the middle ground? I've heard, there's the blanket ban on jobs because you have a criminal record, or there's, this very narrow, or there's just an elimination of background check altogether, right? If that's our spectrum, where is the happy medium? Where is the area where people can get jobs, employers can protect themselves?
I hope I'm not talking too much, but I think what we saw with background checks was that they were readily accessible. The internet, the widespread sharing of information with the federal government to states and localities, that gave people more information. But more information isn't always better, right? You need good information. And so I think what Restorative Record is doing is it still lives in that same space as the background check, but it's giving you better, more predictive information, right? So it might supplement the background check process, or it might be something that employers gravitate to because it works a little better. We will find that out.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing I would say is it depends on an employer's like appetite, right? If they are looking to increase their candidate pool with this particular population or any population for that matter, then they're going to look for different strategies. I think Lovely called it it's a talent strategy. It's a talent strategy, right? So maybe there are laws or policies in your particular hiring jurisdiction, right? We can figure those out, map that onto whatever system you're using on the back end, and enable you to make good on the commitments you have to improving your organization. And if you're averse to any of that, right, and there are no laws, then I think your business is going to suffer essentially from doing that, or your organization. And so, and I think in the spirit of being competitive, right, businesses are going to start looking at companies who are implementing these talent strategies and then finding creative ways to do that. One way is through software, but it takes a people component as well, and being a bit of a visionary. And I'll pass it to Lovely.
I feel like there's a happy medium, and that's what we're striving to be. We don't want to ever, reject any candidates out of hand, and we don't want a free for all for anyone to walk onto our campus. So we've got to find some way where we can be welcoming and measured at the same time. And I feel like this is creating a structure for us to have that happy medium, and that's what we're striving for.
Well, on that note, I want to thank our panelists. Thank you so much. To our audience and our viewers, thank you. If you want to learn more, the ILR Criminal Justice and Employment Initiative at Cornell has more information if you want to adopt a restorative record or learn more about how to improve hiring practices. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.